Hello, my name is Stan Copeland, and I'm the pastor of Lovers Lane United Methodist Church here in the North Texas Conference. And we've just had our clergy session. We're at Custer Road United Methodist Church, and I'm with some of my friends. I want to introduce them. We have Sheron Patterson. She is the pastor of Hamilton Park, and we have Michael Bowie, and Michael is the pastor of St. Luke Community. We have Maria Dixon Hall. She's at SMU. She's the advisor to the provost there. And we have Dianna Masters. She works in the conference office in church development. And right here we have Ron Henderson. He's the district superintendent of the North Central District of the North Texas Conference. I do want to ask, Ron, I want to ask you the first question. Ron has been a delegate to General Conference, and I want to thank you for this, for 32 years. He's got experience. He's seen a lot of the conversation that's gone on, been a part of a lot of that. And Ron, I'd like to just start with you and ask you just some of your reflections on this last General Conference we had, 2019 in St. Louis.
Well, the 2018 General Conference was different than any I've been to for a number of reasons. Number one, I've seen greater arguments than I saw in 2019. But the other General Conference arguments were about legislation. Mm-hmm. So people would argue about the legislation, and then they would be friends. This was more human, about full inclusion, and therefore the argument really got personal, and people left with hurt feelings and really uncertainty about the future. It was also different that there was one legislative committee, and the powers that be could control things more.
Yeah. Good insight. Well, what about General Conference? I know that there just seemed to be such a divide, and there seemed to be more of a global divide than I've ever seen. But it seemed to take on more of a racial flair than we've seen in the past. Could Maria, you want to address that?
Well, I mean, Ron has been a veteran of these conferences, but I think he would say that even this has started, we were talking off camera, since 2012 back in Tampa. One of the things that was so disturbing about General Conference in 2019 was this willingness to put a lot of blame on an entire continent of people. To hear that it was the Africans' fault. To hear Africa associated with bribery, to hear them with being backwards, to hear them being like childlike. Those are the kind of tropes and messages that we've heard all of our lives here in the United States. And it's a way of dismissing the intellectual and really the moral freedom that our brothers and sisters throughout the continent of Africa have. But it also said to me that as much as we like to pretend we have it together on race, the way that we talk about the brothers and sisters in Africa, sadly, is still the way the black church is talked about in many of the circles in our conferences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You said the way we pretend we have it together on race. We do not have it together on race. And this whole thing with the Africans and the mistreatment of them, the Methodist Church needs to go back and look at the colonization of the African nations and see their part in that. Yes. But for us around this group today, talking about going forward, it is really about taking the blame off the Africans, realizing there are a lot of conservatives in the room and spreading that around, and then deciding, putting race in a stronger place. Yeah. Getting our denomination to have some passion about black men being killed in the street. Getting us to have some passion about brown children down on the border being separated from their parents for years. When we see that passion for racism the same way it is for the LGBTQ community, then I think we will have a United Methodist Church.
I want to talk also, I was an observer at General Conference, and it's amazing, Maria, how when I sat there and I thought about the Methodist Church, it took me back to 1787. And when I was in seminary, I remember reading about Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. And when they were in the church in Philadelphia, and they were tolerated, they were good preachers, good leaders. But when the things shifted, when blacks started growing in the church, they were pulled up out of the church. And I realized that as African Americans in this denomination, we're tolerated, but we're not truly celebrated and fully accepted. And I saw at General Conference, once again, a people, global and local, tolerated, but never truly embraced, accepted, and celebrated. So that's a passion and a concern I have for United Methodist Church.
And also on that, Dr. Bowie, I think we have to pay attention to what is actually happening in our African American church. In the United Methodist Church in the United States, we have more black bishops, more black district superintendents, more black council directors across this nation, and fewer churches. What's up with that? Racism is alive and well, and we need to pay attention to it. We need to understand that the LGBT community need to be included, but look at who's kicked under the bus. That's us. We've been set aside, put back behind the corner, and if we have one person of color's face in the conference office, then they feel like they have given us all that we deserve. It's time for black folks, men and women, to stand up, be the church. We need to be about making disciples because God has called us to do that for such a time as this. And this General Conference 2020 is when we need to stand up and be the black church and realize and make public that the main issue is racism in the United Methodist Church. It has been and it will continue to be.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that I think makes this impossible for us to talk about, Stan, is that when African Americans start talking about race, it makes our white brothers and sisters incredibly defensive. Right. It makes them incredibly uncomfortable. And it makes them have to defend something they really don't even understand. And so one of the things that I've tried to do, even in my life, is try to explain that there is a difference between an ideology of whiteness, which is racism, and white skin. One you can participate in, the other one you had no choice in. And it's how we have gone about dealing with race in the United Methodist Church. One of the ways we've tried to satisfy it is by counting people. And we have used counting people as inclusion rather than looking at the systems, the procedures, the people who get to vote, and the people who get to speak when things get bad. One of the things you looked at in General Conference 2019 was when everything fell apart. It was not a diverse group that got up there. The people who are calling for the new expressions of Methodism don't look like us. They may be invited to the table to say that there were people included, but they don't look like us.
But there is a difference. But first off, before I get to that, let me put General Conference in a proper context. Since I've gone a number of times, I think one of the real things about General Conference, it is totally dysfunctional. Going back to 2008, it is as dysfunctional as Congress. You have a goodly number of progressives and a goodly number of conservatives, and even before we got to the LGBTQ agenda, we haven't gotten anything accomplished since Tampa. And maybe going back to the 80s or 90s, General Conference is very dysfunctional, and I think whatever good comes in United Methodism now is not going to happen in General Conference. So there are groups putting together conversations about other expressions, but there are a number of African Americans who may have been invited simply because we were of color, not to have any real power of voice, who decided we would have power of voice. And so we have formulated our own group and had our own meetings, one in Washington, D.C., and we'll have another, to make certain if there is another expression, we are full, equal partners.
Right. Amen. As we talk about the importance of racism, many times sexism gets swept under the rug. And as a black clergywoman, I live at the intersection of racism and sexism. And as we fight to get our power as black people, women sometimes get stuck under the rug, get pushed to the side. What were the numbers of women at the black clergy women at the Expressions meeting? What were the number of black clergy women at the meeting in Washington, D.C.? In this jurisdiction, we have as of yet to elect a black female bishop. So there's sexism and racism floating all around that we can see visibly, but we don't want to articulate because I guess it's difficult and painful to make room for that topic alongside racism, and black women often are forced to choose.
That's true. Now, at the first meeting that they've had for a different expression, no African Americans were invited. And then somebody said, oops, we better get somebody here. And so when they met in Atlanta, they knew BMCR was meeting at the same time. Right. And that was to put some spice or some color in it. I wasn't invited. I called and said, I want to be at the table.
And I would say this, in DC, there were a lot of African American females there. And I think it's so important, if I'm going to be at the table, I'm going to make sure there's full inclusion, that African American females, LGBTQ, people on the margins will be at the table. And I think it's important, as we begin to wrap up, that if we're going to make sure this happens, I believe we need to go back to the baptismal vows that we made. We don't have to create anything new. It's right there in front of us. We have to speak to any form of evil, injustice, and oppression that presents itself. We all made that vow as both lay and clergy. And if we're at the table, we have to speak truth to power and make sure, and I learned this a long time ago, if we're not at the table, we're probably on the menu.
That's it. Exactly. And I think, Dr. Bowie, you're so right. I think we have to learn again how to have a conversation with each other. We've been having monologues where we talk at each other, but we don't know how to have a dialogue. We don't have people who can really facilitate that dialogue anymore. And I think one of the things that I want to bring from the university setting back into the church is the ability, we live on a campus where there's all kinds of expression of sexuality and gender and religion, and there's difference, and we come together under one banner, SMU. I think that's something we can bring back to the church, is how can we be in relationship and still see different things? It is possible. And I think if we have the right tenor and tone, but we also recognize that I'm hurting and you're hurting and you're hurting, and just because people hear us talk about African American issues, we have not forgotten about our brothers and sisters who are in the rural churches, who are still trying to pull it together. We have not forgotten about our brothers and sisters who are living in the inner city churches, who are still trying to make it work. We haven't forgotten about the retirees who have to wonder about apportionments and how that's going to affect them. We have bigger issues, and we all bring a different part of who we are to this conversation. But we cannot leave out things that are uncomfortable, whether it's racism, whether it's the reality of being poor and white in America, whether it is being gay, lesbian, bisexual, whether it's being a woman, or whether it's the geographical games we play in the Methodist Church.
In the midst of, I'm sorry, Dianna, go ahead.
No, go right ahead.
In the midst of all this turmoil and turbulence that we're talking about, I see the possibility for change for the good. I think sometimes God will take you down low to bring you back up the way you should be. God prunes a lot of times to get away excess stuff. And we are being pruned right now, I think, pruned to be a much better version of who we were before. Part of my experience has been in broken churches and coming into churches where people have been spiritually decimated, and I've been able to come in there and rebuild them and heal them and renew them. And I believe the same thing can happen for this denomination. Once all the dust is settled, it's time to come in and rebuild and heal and be the people that God is calling us to be.
And I agree with you, Sheron. I think it's time for us to be the people that God's called us to be. My concern still is, why is it all of these years black women have been left out of the table? I don't want to leave that out of the equation. I don't want to leave our LGBTQ out of the equation. I don't want to leave racism out of the equation. We can talk about our hopes and dreams, but 2020 is coming up. Delegates about to be elected. And I want us to make sure that we are aware that racism is alive and well. God has a purpose with the black church, and I want to be a part of strengthening that black church, and for us making disciples for the transformation of the world where we live.
I want to thank y'all for this conversation. It's been extremely enlightening. You know, what I hope for, and Maria, you were getting at this, that there is going to be a new expression of what we know now as the United Methodist Church. There's no way around it. There will be a split of some sort. But I hope that we don't break into echo chamber churches where we all believe alike, where we all listen to the same voices, and we live out the same basic faith. I hope for a church that has a multiplicity of voices, that does challenge and does raise the tough questions and live in the tough places and sees the value in all of us being together like we've never been before. I mean, y'all are very well aware of that, like we've never been before. And I think this conversation has brought us to a place where we're actually having real talk go on. And perhaps out of that real talk can come some real action. Now, we hope for you, the audience of Methodist Sojourners, that you will join this dialogue. It's been quite a great one. And that you will log on and that you'll express your views, your opinions, and I'm sure that you'll hear from some of our panelists here as they will respond to you. May God bless you. Thank you.
Bless you.